when you break a bone, the X-ray is, well, it's binary.
Right. Completely black and white.
Exactly. The doctor just throws the film up on the light box, points to that jagged white line and says, there it is, broken. It's clean, it's categorized, and in a weird way, it's actually really comforting.
Because it's a visible, isolated problem, right, with a known mechanical fix.
Right, exactly. But then, and this is where it gets messy, you try to take an X-ray of an entire nation's geopolitical and economic health, and the machine just completely shorts out. The image is totally murky.
Oh, absolutely.
You're left staring at this massive overlapping web where, think about it. A single commercial ship getting stuck in the Strait of Hormuz somehow rewrites the interest rate on a bank account for a guy living in New Jersey.
Yeah, it's the ultimate diagnostic challenge. We're trying to understand the health of a subcontinent based on, a million disparate yet deeply interconnected data points.
And that is exactly the puzzle we are going to solve today. Welcome to you, our listener, to the Daily Deep Dive or 3D initiative of UPSC with Saurabh Kaushik. Today's mission is to connect the dots across 18 critical GS Paper 2 and GS Paper 3 topics from today's sources.
Right, making sense of how global diplomacy, economics, tech, and domestic policy all just intertwine into one massive narrative.
The goal isn't to just, recite a list of headlines, right? It's to understand the underlying plumbing. We want to see the causality, the why, and the how behind these massive policy shifts.
Exactly. We need to look at the gears turning underneath it all.
So brace yourself, because we are starting with a 1-minute index sprint. We are going to cover 18 topics serially today, weaving them into a single story. Ready?
Let's do it.
Here we go. 1. The SAGAR Plus doctrine in the Indian Ocean. 2. The India-UK CETA trade deal launching July 15th. 3. The international legalities of attacking neutral ships. 4. The operationalization of Army integrated battle groups. 5. Priority interventions for 25 struggling tiger reserves. 6. The resumption of the India-China strategic economic dialogue. 7. Constitutional guardrails against AI digital slavery. 8. The new Anaemia Mukt norms. 9. The PLI push and post-Hormuz energy diversity.
Halfway there.
10. The Indian Army in Seychelles and the Modi-Mauritius bilateral. 11. FCNR loan rates edging higher. 12. Life on Mars and NASA perseverance data. 13. Smart AI caching for disaster management. 14. A new auditing portal for rural schemes. 15. The Kerala PMA logo row and cooperative federalism. 16. How schools are tackling adolescent malnutrition. 17. The Diksha digital learning ecosystem. And finally, 18. 12 years of digital India.
Wow. That is quite the geopolitical and domestic marathon.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, let's unpack this, starting from the outside in. We're going to begin in the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, looking at PM Modi's recent visit to Seychelles.
Right.
This is the first bilateral visit by an Indian prime minister to Seychelles in 12 years. And the big headline here is a massive shift in military and diplomatic doctrine, moving from the 2015 SAGAR doctrine to something new called SAGAR plus state.
Right, and to understand that shift, we really have to look at the mechanical reality of what the original SAGAR doctrine was trying to do.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Well, back in March 2015, PM Modi went to Mauritius and announced SAGAR, which stands for Security and Growth for All in the Region. The foundational architecture of that doctrine was establishing India as the, and this is the key phrase, net security provider in the Indian Ocean region, or the IOR.
So taking the lead, basically.
Exactly. India was essentially stepping up to say, hey, we have the biggest navy in the neighborhood. We will shoulder the financial and logistical burden of keeping these waters safe, ensuring freedom of navigation, and maintaining a rules-based order.
Right. It's like India volunteered to be the sole neighborhood security guard. We were going to walk the beat, check the locks, make sure the streets were safe for all the other houses on the block.
That's a great way to put it.
But now, in 2026, in Seychelles, we have the articulation of SAGAR plus care. What does that plus actually change in the mechanics of the policy?
The plus fundamentally alters the burden of cost. It introduces the formulation of shared responsibility. The Prime Minister stated that creating an ocean of opportunity requires that responsibility be distributed among the Indian Ocean Rim Association, or IORA, states.
So it's no longer just India footing the bill.
Exactly. It's no longer about India writing a blank check for protection. It's about establishing a highly coordinated multinational neighborhood watch where everyone chips in with ships, radar data, and funding.
Okay, but I have to play devil's advocate here. Why the shift now? Does India suddenly not have the budget for a blue water navy? I mean, why couldn't we just maintain that prestige of being the sole provider?
Well, it's not just about prestige, right? It's about physical capability in the face of new, overwhelming threats. The catalyst for this doctrinal shift was the recent Hormuz war that took place between February and June of 2026.
Right, it was a huge deal.
It was a massive systemic wake-up call. It proved that localized disruptions in maritime choke points don't just temporarily inconvenience in India, they structurally threaten all IORA economies. Collectively, these states import over 60% of their energy through the Indian Ocean region.
Wow. 60%.
Yeah. So when a crisis hits, you suddenly need anti-piracy escorts, specialized mine clearance vessels, constant aerial surveillance, and all of that happening simultaneously across millions of square miles of ocean. No single navy, not even the U.S. Navy, let alone India's, can shoulder that logistical burden entirely alone.
That makes total sense. You can't police an entire ocean by yourself when every other nation is simultaneously screaming for their oil tankers to be escorted.
No.
So if we need a neighborhood watch, we need watchtowers. And part of this strategy involves some very specific real estate, right? The sources mention the Assumption Island Joint Facility.
Yes. Assumption Island is a total game changer geographically. It's the southernmost island of Seychelles, way out in the outer island group. PM Modi and Seychelles President Wavell Ramkalawan just finalized the progress on this joint maritime facility.
And what does that facility actually include?
It includes a deepwater jetty, a runway, and barracks. India has committed over 800 crore rupees to this, and Seychelles has provided land rights for 30 years, aiming for a 2027 operational date.
Just to picture this on a map, why is Assumption Island so important compared to our existing bases? I mean, we already have the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in the east.
Because of the geometry of radar and logistics. Andaman and Nicobar is our anchor in the northeast. But Assumption Island gives India a physical logistics base over 1,500 kilometers deeper into the western Indian Ocean.
Oh, I see. So instead of just relying on the unsinkable aircraft carrier metaphor, it's like placing a high-tech Ring doorbell 1,500 kilometers down your driveway. You can see who is approaching your house hours or even days before they get near your front porch.
That's spot on. It provides surveillance coverage over the southwestern Indian Ocean, which is the critical approach vector for narcotics trafficking routes coming down from the Makrine coast.
Right.
As well as piracy approaches from the Horn of Africa, and crucially, the movement of foreign naval vessels, particularly from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps or the Chinese PLA Navy, entering via the Cape of Good Hope.
That's a huge operational advantage.
It is. And this strategic alignment isn't just a cold military transaction either. There is a deep demographic foundation here. The Indian diaspora actually makes up about 5% of Seychelles' total population.
Wait, really? 5% might sound small in India, but in a small island nation, that's significant demographic weight.
It is. It's about 96,000 people. This community migrated during the British colonial period, primarily from Gujarat and Western India. So the diplomacy is built on centuries of cultural ties.
That explains a lot.
Yeah, and this is why you see agreements layered on top of the military facility, like expanding UPI digital payments to Seychelles and funding an India-Seychelles scholarship program. It's a holistic integration.
But securing these massive maritime shipping lanes is just the infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
The real prize, the reason we care so deeply about the safety of these waters, is the staggering volume of trade flowing through them.
Absolutely.
Which leads us to the cargo itself and our second major area of focus today. The monumental India-UK Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA, which opens on July 15th.
This is perhaps the most significant chapter in India-UK bilateral ties in decades. When CETA goes live, the immediate economic shockwave is going to be profound.
I was looking at the tariff schedules in the notes, and the numbers are just jarring. UK tariffs dropped to 0 on 99.1% of lines immediately. Not phased in over a decade. Right away. That is an absolute leveling of the playing field for Indian goods.
And to understand the mechanics of why that matters, look at a sector like textiles, which is the largest single beneficiary. India currently exports over 30,000 crore rupees of textiles and clothing to the UK annually.
Yeah, okay.
Before CETA, the UK imposed a 12% tariff on these goods. Dropping that to 0 instantly saves Indian exporters roughly 3,600 crore rupees a year in taxes they used to pay to the British government.
So if you are a knitwear factory owner in Tirupur, Tamil Nadu, or you deal in synthetic textiles in Surat, Gujarat, Your product just became 12% cheaper on a shelf in London overnight.
Without you having to cut a single corner on manufacturing costs.
That instantly makes you competitive against nations like Bangladesh or Vietnam, who already have preferential access.
It's a direct injection of competitiveness. We're also seeing zero duty for footwear, which previously faced a staggering 16% tariff. Processed food, engineering goods, IT hardware, marine products, all zeroed out. But the physical goods are only half the story. The services sector component of CETA is where the plumbing gets really interesting.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, specifically the Double Contribution Convention, or DCC. The sources highlight that this single clause saves Indian IT professionals and major companies like TCS, Infosys, and Wipro around $500 million annually.
That's right.
How does the DCC actually work mechanically? I mean, why were they losing that money in the first place?
It's a brilliant fix to a deeply frustrating bureaucratic loophole. Previously, if an Indian IT firm won a contract in London and sent a software engineer there on a temporary assignment, say, for 2 or 3 years, that professional was legally required to pay UK national insurance contributions out of their salary.
Even though they were never going to retire in the UK or use the UK pension system.
Exactly. They were paying into a social security system they would never benefit from, while simultaneously still being tied to the Indian social security system back home.
Yeah.
It was basically double taxation on labor.
That's wild.
The DCC legally recognizes this. It exempts Indian professionals on temporary visas from paying UK national insurance for up to 5 years. When you aggregate that across the thousands of employees stationed in the UK by India's tech giants, it cuts their operational overhead by $500 million a year. That money goes straight back onto the Indian companies' balance sheets.
That is massive. Now, trade is a two-way street. India is also reducing tariffs on UK goods, but the notes say we are doing it on a completely different timeline.
Yes, and this highlights the negotiating leverage India held. India's tariff reductions on UK goods are scheduled over a phased 7 to 10 year period.
So we get immediate access, but they have to wait.
Right. We are opening our markets slowly to allow domestic industries time to adapt. Furthermore, India carved out highly sensitive exclusions. Sectors deeply tied to rural livelihoods like dairy, cereals, millets, apples, and edible oils are completely excluded from these tariff cuts to protect Indian farmers from subsidized foreign competition.
Makes sense. And the macro goal here?
The macro goal is to take bilateral trade from the current £36 billion up to £100 billion by 2030.
Okay, here is where I'm a bit confused, though. CETA was negotiated in just 3 years. That is lightning fast for international trade.
Extremely fast.
Meanwhile, India has been trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with the European Union for over 20 years with almost nothing to show for it. Is this proof that a post-Brexit UK is a more agile, nimble trading partner? Or is it proof that the British government is just desperate for a major economic win to justify Brexit to their voters?
Well, it's a combination. But the political necessity of Brexit is definitely the driving force. From the perspective of Whitehall, demonstrating the ability to strike massive independent trade deals outside the EU framework is an existential political requirement.
They have to prove Brexit worked.
Exactly. The UK government is desperately touting CETA as the most comprehensive FTA they've signed since leaving the European bloc. Now, their agility certainly comes from the fact that they no longer have to find consensus among 27 wildly diverse EU member states.
Right, which is why the India-EU talks stall. One country wants dairy access, another wants automobile tariffs cut, and everything just gridlocks.
Exactly. The UK can make unilateral decisions. But make no mistake, India brilliantly leveraged that British political desperation to secure incredibly asymmetric, favorable terms like the immediate 99.1% tariff elimination and the DCC.
So we have this incredible trade pipeline opening up. We are going to be shipping billions of dollars of textiles, engineering goods, and hardware to the UK. But that entire economic victory relies on a geographical vulnerability.
The shipping lanes.
Those ships have to physically navigate the global oceans, which brings us out of the boardroom and into the terrifying legal limbo currently playing out in the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, this is where diplomacy meets international maritime law. We are looking at the specific catalyst of Iran firing on a commercial container ship, the Ever Lovely, on June 25th.
Let's look at the facts of this specific ship. The Ever Lovely was a commercial container vessel. It was operated by a Taiwanese company, and it was flying a Singapore flag. It was a completely neutral ship. Yet Iran fired upon it.
That's correct.
The sources say Iran's justification was that the ship used an unauthorized route and bypassed something called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority. Is that legal? Can a coastal state just draw imaginary lanes in an international strait and shoot at anyone who crosses the line?
Under international law, absolutely not. The framework governing this is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, known as UNCLOS, and the laws are incredibly strict regarding neutral ships. Attacking a neutral merchant vessel in an international strait is presumptively unlawful.
Are there any exceptions?
There are only very narrow specific exceptions. You can lawfully attack a neutral ship if it is actively carrying weapons or contraband to an enemy, if it is directly assisting enemy military operations, or if it is running a lawfully declared blockade.
And the Ever-Lovely was carrying commercial cargo. It wasn't arming anyone.
Precisely. Let's dig into the legal mechanics of UNCLOS. Article 38 deals specifically with the concept of transit passage. It guarantees that all ships, regardless of their flag, have the right of continuous and expeditious transit through straits used for international navigation like Hormuz.
So Iran can't just block it?
No. Coastal states bordering the strait like Iran and Oman are legally bound not to hamper that transit. Furthermore, Article 44 is even more explicit. It states that bordering states cannot suspend transit passage even temporarily, and they cannot condition passage on compliance with national domestic procedures.
So Iran's setting up this Persian Gulf Strait Authority and demanding ships submit to their routing.
Iran argues that their Muscat Accord created a temporary emergency arrangement requiring all vessels to coordinate with this authority for safety. But in the eyes of international law, the Muscat Accord is not a recognized treaty. It has no international legal force.
It's just their own rule.
It is essentially a domestic regulation that Iran is attempting to violently enforce in international waters.
It's like a homeowner deciding they don't like cars driving past their house, so they put up a private toll booth on a public interstate highway and then start shooting out the tires of anyone who ignores the toll booth.
That is a very accurate legal analogy.
Yeah.
And there is a secondary layer of protection here found in the 1994 San Remo Manual, which is the authoritative restatement of customary international law regarding naval warfare. Rule 67 of the manual explicitly protects neutral merchant vessels.
So the ship was protected on multiple fronts.
Yes. And the Ever-Lovely wasn't just wandering randomly either. It was intentionally using a southern route recommended by the UK Maritime Trade Operations, or UKMTO. This route specifically hugs the coastline to stay within Oman's territorial waters. Oman being a neutral state in this conflict precisely to avoid the Iranian-controlled lanes and the risk of confrontation.
And despite hugging the neutral coast, it was still fired upon. Why is India so deeply, aggressively invested in this specific legal argument, though? Why did we push so hard at the UN General Assembly over this one ship?
Because India's physical vulnerability in the Strait of Hormuz is extreme. Over 40% of India's total crude oil imports transit through that narrow choke point. The mechanical reality right now is grim.
How grim.
There are currently 15 Indian flag vessels and over 40 vessels operating with Indian crews that are effectively trapped as part of a stranded fleet. The International Maritime Organization has paused convoys because the risk is just too high.
Risk from Iranian ships, or is there something else in the water?
The physical environment is highly contaminated. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates there are still roughly 80 unexploded naval mines left adrift in the Hormuz shipping lanes from the peak of the February to June conflict.
Wow, 80 mines just floating out there.
So even if ships use the UKMTO southern route to avoid Iranian patrol boats, they face the immense hidden risk of striking a mine. This is why India requires a massive, coordinated international mine clearance operation. And it's exactly why the SAGAR Plus doctrine of shared responsibility we discussed is no longer optional. It's literally a matter of economic survival.
It's a chilling reminder of how fragile these global supply chains really are. But, you know, vulnerability isn't just maritime. If we pivot from the sea to the land, we face equally daunting challenges right on our own terrestrial borders, specifically the line of actual control with China.
Yes, the LAC.
To address this, the Indian military is currently undergoing one of the most massive structural revolutions in its history. This brings us to Topic 4, the operationalization of the Army's first integrated battle groups, or IBGs, this July.
This is a fundamental rewrite of India's land warfare doctrine. To understand why this is happening, you have to understand the inherent mechanical friction of the old system.
Okay, let's break that down.
For decades, the Indian Army operated on a deeply hierarchical legacy structure. You have a massive core, which controls multiple divisions, which control brigades, which control battalions.
And the sources emphasize that under that old structure, it took days to deploy a meaningful combat force.
Yeah.
If a crisis kicked off, why did it take so long to get troops to the border?
Because of administrative and logistical siloing. In the old system, if a localized conflict erupts, the corps commander has to meticulously pull different assets together. He needs infantry from one division, artillery batteries from another location, armored tanks from a separate brigade, and aviation support from an entirely different command structure.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It is. Each of those units has its own logistics tail, its own specialized ammunition supply chains, and its own commanding officers. Integrating all those separate elements, moving them across difficult terrain, and getting them to communicate on the same radio frequencies takes immense time.
It's like trying to assemble a symphony orchestra from different cities on the actual day of the concert. The brass section is in Delhi, the string section is stuck in traffic in Mumbai, and you are just praying they can all get to the stage and play in sync by 8 p.m.
Exactly. And in modern warfare, taking days to deploy is a death sentence.
So how does the new IBG concept solve that?
If the old system was an uncoordinated orchestra, an integrated battle group is a pre-packaged, fully rehearsed rock band, ready to plug in and play the second they step off the bus.
Well, I like that.
An IBG is a self-contained, combined arms combat unit of roughly 5,000 troops. It is commanded by a major general. From day one, in peacetime, it permanently integrates infantry, armor, artillery, combat engineers, signals, air defense, and crucially, aviation elements like Rudra attack helicopters.
They train together constantly.
Because they train together daily and possess organic logistics to sustain themselves, an IBG can be fully deployed for combat operations within 12 to 48 hours of receiving orders.
48 hours versus multiple days. That is a massive compression of response time. And the first of these units are rolling out from the 17 Mountain Strike Corps based in Panagarh, West Bengal.
The geography of that deployment is highly intentional. The 17 Mountain Strike Corps is India's only strike corps, specifically oriented toward the China threat along the LAC. Army Chief General Upendra Dwivedi recently highlighted that 31 sanction letters were approved in just 14 to 15 months to make this reorganization happen.
Which, in the context of military bureaucracy, is basically warp speed.
Unprecedented.
But why the sudden rush? I mean, why rip apart the old structure and rebuild it so aggressively on the China front right now?
It is a direct reaction to the post-Galwan reality. The Chinese People's Liberation Army, the PLA, has radically altered the physical landscape along the LAC since the 2020 clashes. They have built an extensive network of all-weather roads, forward airfields, hardened bunkers, and dual-use border villages.
So they can move fast.
Yeah. This infrastructure allows the PLA to mass troops at the border rapidly. India needed a structural answer to match that rapid deployment capability. The old, slow divisional structure was just too cumbersome to react to localized incursions. IBGs allow India to respond instantly at the sector level, cutting off PLA movements before they can dig in.
But it's not just about moving 5,000 guys faster. The technology inside these IBGs sounds like it's pulled straight from a sci-fi novel. The sources specifically mention the integration of AI, referencing Pyrav battalions and Divyastra batteries. What exactly are those?
These represent the integration of autonomous and electronic warfare into the infantry level.
Mm-hmm.
Pyrav battalions are units heavily equipped with loitering munitions, often referred to as kamikaze drones.
Okay.
Unlike traditional artillery, which fires a dumb shell at a coordinate, a loitering munition can be launched, hover in a designated area for hours, use AI optical recognition to identify high-value targets like radar trucks or command vehicles, and then dive down to strike them with pinpoint accuracy.
Wow. And Divyastra?
Divyastra batteries are focused on AI-enabled electronic warfare, or EW. In modern combat, the side that controls the electromagnetic spectrum wins. Divyastra units use artificial intelligence to instantly analyze the enemy's radar and radio communication frequencies in real time.
So they figure out how the enemy is talking.
And then the AI automatically calibrates jamming signals or spoofs their communications, blinding the enemy. All of this technology, the drones, the AI jamming, the rapid deployment, is designed for one singular purpose: to compress the ODA loop.
The OD loop. Observe, orient, decide, act.
Correct. It is a concept developed by fighter pilots. If your military can observe a situation, orient its forces, decide on a tactic, and act on it faster than your enemy can complete their own cycle, you get inside their decision loop.
You force them to react to old information.
You force them to constantly react to your last move, eventually causing their command structure to collapse into confusion. The IBG structure compresses the Indian Army's audio loop from days down to mere hours.
It is a breathtaking modernization. We are optimizing our defenses against external human threats with AI, drones, and rapid deployment forces. But while we pour billions into securing the harsh terrain of the borders, internally, within the very heartland of the country, some of our most majestic national assets are facing an existential threat of a completely different kind.
This is a tough transition, but a necessary one.
Yeah. This brings us to the domestic environment and a deeply concerning report for Topic 5. 25 of India's 58 tiger reserves have been flagged for priority intervention.
This issue perfectly illustrates the paradox of plenty in Indian wildlife conservation. If you look at the macro data, India's tiger conservation program is widely hailed as a massive global success story.
I mean, we always hear good news about the tiger numbers.
Right. The most recent comprehensive census in 2022 counted 3,682 tigers. That is the highest population in 50 years, and it accounts for over 75% of the entire global wild tiger population.
That sounds like an incredible win. We have nearly 3,700 tigers. So why are the alarm bells ringing? Why did the National Tiger Conservation Authority, the NTCA, issue an internal assessment stating that 25 out of 58 reserves are struggling with fewer or no big cats?
The crisis isn't about the total numbers. It's about spatial distribution and genetic isolation. You have massive source populations in places like Jim Corbett in Uttarakhand or Bedapur in Karnataka. These reserves are thriving. They are practically overflowing with tigers, sometimes even exceeding their ecological carrying capacity.
Okay.
But on the other end of the spectrum, you have 25 reserves that are functionally empty or severely depleted. The NTCA categorizes these struggling reserves into 3 distinct types. First, you have the historical reserve.
Like which ones?
These are places like Palamu in Jharkhand or Bor in Maharashtra. When Project Tiger was launched back in 1973, these were prime habitats with healthy populations. Over the decades, they lost their tigers primarily due to a relentless poaching, massive habitat degradation from mining or encroachment, and the subsequent loss of the ungulate prey base.
Okay, but if a reserve like Palamu manages to stop the poaching, and they still have 5 or 6 tigers left, shouldn't the population naturally bounce back over time? Why is it an emergency?
This is where we have to discuss the mechanics of population genetics. The sources explicitly mention the threat of inbreeding depression.
What does that mean in this context?
If a localized tiger population drops below a critical threshold, usually around 8 to 10 breeding adults, and they are geographically cut off from other tiger populations by highways or cities, they have no choice but to interbreed with close relatives. Over multiple generations, this lack of genetic diversity leads to inbreeding depression. The genetic alleles that cause deformities, lower immune function, and reduce fertility become dominant. The tigers lose their biological fitness. They become highly susceptible to diseases. Even if not a single poacher enters the forest, the population will go locally extinct simply through genetic decay.
That is deeply tragic. They survive the guns and the snares only to be defeated by their own DNA because they are trapped in a forest island. Now, the second category of struggling reserves mentioned includes newly notified ones, like the Madhav Tiger Reserve in Madhya Pradesh or Dholpur Karoli in Rajasthan.
Yes.
Wait a second. If there are no tigers there, why is the government declaring them tiger reserves?
It seems counterintuitive, but it is a highly proactive, engineered conservation strategy. You don't just declare a reserve because tigers are currently living there. Sometimes you declare a reserve to legally protect and engineer the habitat first.
To prep the ground.
The strategy with a place like Madhav is to secure the legal boundaries of the forest, evict encroachments, and heavily invest in restoring the prey-based breeding and releasing deer, wild pigs, and nilgai. You build a perfect, fully stocked home in the hopes that it will act as a sink habitat, facilitating natural tiger immigration from overcrowded source populations like Ranthambore.
Ah, build it and they will come. But they can only come if there is an actual physical path to travel. A tiger can't just take a bus from Ranthambore to Madhav.
Exactly. Which brings us to the most critical, yet fragile, infrastructure in conservation wildlife corridors. Tigers are incredibly wide-ranging territorial animals. Young males looking for their own territory can easily travel 50 to 200 kilometers.
That's a huge distance to cover without getting hit by a car or shot.
Without contiguous protected forest corridors connecting these fragmented reserves, the small populations are genetically doomed. India currently have 32 identified major wildlife corridors. The Terai Arc landscape, which connects forests across Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and into Nepal, and the complex web of corridors in the Western Ghats are absolutely vital.
So what are the interventions the NTCA is pushing?
The NTCA's priority interventions for these 25 struggling reserves aren't just about throwing more guards in the forest. They involve emergency prey restoration, highly intensive anti-poaching tech, legally securing these migration corridors against infrastructure development, and in some desperate cases, the active physical translocation of tigers by helicopter from rich reserves to depleted ones to manually inject genetic diversity.
It's fascinating how heavily managed nature actually is. It's not just put a fence around it and leave it alone. It is a highly engineered biological management effort.
Very much so.
And just as we must carefully manage and protect these fragile wildlife corridors to ensure biological survival, policymakers in New Delhi have to manage incredibly fragile diplomatic corridors to ensure economic survival. This transitions us perfectly into our next massive challenge. Let's look at topic 6, the intense debate over resuming the India-China strategic economic dialogue.
This is undoubtedly one of the most delicate, high-stakes policy debates currently happening in the corridors of power. The India-China Strategic Economic Dialogue, or SED, was historically a high-level institutionalized mechanism. It was a forum where top officials negotiated market access, massive infrastructure investments, and tried to address structural trade imbalances.
But this dialogue was entirely abruptly frozen by India in June 2020.
Right. Following the Galwan Valley clash, where 20 Indian soldiers were killed in hand-to-hand combat on the LAC, the relationship effectively hit a wall.
So why is there a push to resume this dialogue now, 6 years later in 2026?
Right.
Has the ground reality actually changed?
Well, the argument in favor of resumption rests on a careful reading of recent geopolitical and economic indicators. Diplomatically, there is a perception of a post-Galwan new normal. Reports over the last year indicate that the most severe friction points at Dipsang and Demchok on the LAC have seen localized, negotiated resolutions and disengagements.
So things have cooled down a bit.
We are seeing Indian pilgrims being allowed to resume the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra. Furthermore, at the recent BRICS National Security Advisors meeting, China's Wang Yi signaled a distinct willingness to re-engage on broader issues. There is a cautious sense that the geopolitical temperature has dialed back from a boil to a simmer.
That covers the diplomatic optics, but there is a massive, quantifiable economic driver forcing this conversation, isn't there? The trade deficit.
The trade deficit is the elephant in the room, and it is the most compelling, pragmatic argument for resumption. India's trade deficit with China has ballooned to a staggering $85 billion in FY26. $85 billion. To put that in perspective, we are importing roughly $105 billion worth of goods from China and only exporting about $20 billion to them. And we aren't just importing cheap plastic toys anymore.
Right, it's not just consumer junk.
This deficit is driven by the very arteries of the modern economy: highly specialized electronics, advanced manufacturing machinery, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and solar panels. Proponents of the SED argue that an $85 billion structural dependency is simply unsustainable.
So we need to talk to them to fix it.
You cannot manage a deficit that large without a structured, high-level mechanism to sit across the table and demand reciprocal market access for Indian pharma and IT services in China.
So the pragmatic argument is essentially, we despise what they did at the border, but we have to talk to them because we're bleeding $85 billion a year to them. But there is a very strong counter-argument, especially from the defense and strategic community, warning against this.
Absolutely. The case against resumption is deeply rooted in the realities of national sovereignty and long-term strategic posturing. Critics accurately point out that while Demchok might be quiet, the PLA's macro infrastructure buildup near the LAC, the roads, the bunkers, the airfields we discussed regarding the IBGs has not stopped. It continues unabated.
And what about CPEC?
Exactly. Furthermore, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, which physically runs through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, remains a fundamental ongoing violation of Indian territorial sovereignty.
And there is the psychological and political optic of it all. The 1962 strategic hangover is real. If India resumes the SED, doesn't it look like New Delhi is capitulating? Doesn't it look like we're rewarding Chinese military aggression by returning to business as usual without securing any permanent, verifiable concessions on the border?
That is the exact fear. It risks signaling weakness. So what is the policy response? How do you solve this paradox? The delicate balance that seems to be emerging in New Delhi is a strategy of compartmentalization.
What does that actually mean in practice?
It means strictly separating the border disputes from the economic necessities. The idea is that India can cautiously resume the SED on a highly restricted, strictly economic track to try and manage this $85 billion deficit, while simultaneously maintaining a hardline, heavily militarized stance on the territorial track, like deploying those IBGs.
Right.
You talk trade in one room while preparing for conflict in the other.
Here's where the mechanics of this get really interesting and deeply ironic to me. India is currently executing a massive historic push for domestic manufacturing. We want to be the factory of the world. We want Make in India to replace Made in China.
Right.
But to build those massive factories in Gujarat or Tamil Nadu to manufacture those electronics and solar panels, we rely heavily on importing the specialized Chinese machinery and raw components to set up the assembly lines. We literally need Chinese inputs to build our economic independence from China.
It's a complete paradox.
You cannot decouple instantly without completely crashing your own domestic manufacturing ambitions. It is an incredibly difficult tightrope walk.
It is the defining geopolitical and economic paradox of this decade for India. The very tools needed for self-reliance are currently held by your primary strategic rival.
Speaking of manufacturing ambitions, economic realities, and the modern workforce, while policymakers in New Delhi worry about international trade deficits and border disputes, there is a stark, very human domestic reality brewing right in our cities regarding the people who actually power the daily economy.
Yes, the gig economy.
Exactly. Let's shift our focus to topic 7, the rise of what commentators are terming new digital slavery and the urgent need for constitutional guardrails in the gig economy.
This is a profound intersection of technology, labor rights, and constitutional law. We're talking about the millions of gig workers in India, the delivery riders racing through traffic for Zomato and Swiggy, the drivers working 14-hour shifts for Uber and Ola, the package sorters for Amazon Flex.
How many people are we actually talking about?
Back in 2021, the Niti Aayog estimated there were roughly 7.7 million gig workers in the country. Today, that number is likely well over 10 million. It is the fastest-growing employment category in India's formal economy.
But the editorial highlighted in the sources uses an incredibly provocative phrase, new digital slavery. That implies severe systemic exploitation. What specifically is triggering that kind of terminology?
The core issue, the mechanical heart of the exploitation, is AI-driven algorithmic management. In a traditional blue-collar or white-collar job, you have a human manager. If there's a miscommunication, a delay, or a problem, you can walk into an office, explain the context, and plead your case.
Right.
In the gig economy, your manager is an impenetrable algorithm. AI systems assign tasks based on opaque metrics. They set nearly impossible delivery time limits. They constantly rate performance based on customer whims. They implement dynamic surge pricing that arbitrarily dictates a worker's daily take-home pay. And crucially, they possess the power to terminate a worker's account to fire them instantly with zero human oversight.
So a delivery rider could wake up at 6 a.m., find their app permanently blocked because a line of code flagged an anomaly in their GPS data from the night before, and their entire livelihood is instantly gone. And there is no human HR department they can appeal to.
Precisely. And this is where it elevates from a bad labor practice to a legitimate constitutional crisis. Article 21 of the Indian Constitution guarantees the fundamental right to life.
Which includes livelihood, right?
Yes. Over decades of jurisprudence, the Supreme Court has expansively interpreted Article 21 to include the right to livelihood and the right to live with human dignity. When an invisible algorithmic boss can arbitrarily instantly terminate your sole source of livelihood without any due process, without any transparency, and without any right of appeal, it poses a direct systemic threat to those fundamental constitutional protections.
Wait a second. Didn't Parliament just pass a massive landmark data protection law, the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, the DPDP Act of 2023? If the DPDP Act says Indian citizens have a fundamental right to know how their personal data is being used, why can't a gig worker use that law to demand to know exactly why the algorithm fired them?
You've identified the exact legal chasm. On paper, Section 16 of the DPDP Act gives a data principal, in this case, the gig worker the right to know the purpose for which their data is being processed. Legal scholars argue this should implicitly cover the right to an explanation for automated algorithmic decisions that severely impact them.
So the law is there, but
But the mechanical implementation and enforcement of the DPDP Act in the specific context of gig platform management is effectively non-existent right now. The platforms fiercely guard their algorithms as proprietary intellectual property and trade secrets. A delivery rider making 500 rupees a day has absolutely no legal or financial leverage to force a multi-billion-dollar tech platform to open its black box.
Okay, if the data privacy law isn't working, what about traditional labor laws? Why can't these 10 million workers just form a recognized union and strike for better conditions?
That is the secondary loophole, and it's intentionally built into the business model. Under the Industrial Relations Code of 2020, gig workers are legally classified as independent contractors or partners, not as formal workers or employees.
Oh, so they aren't employees?
Exactly. This specific legal classification deliberately strips them of collective bargaining rights, mandatory minimum wage protections, provident fund contributions, and standard job security. In 2021, the UK Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling stating that Uber drivers are indeed workers for the purposes of employment law, but India has not yet adopted that precedent on a national level.
Is anyone in India trying to fix this mechanically, or are we just waiting for the courts to intervene?
There is movement at the state level. The Rajasthan model is currently the pioneer. In 2023, they enacted the Rajasthan Platform-Based Gig Workers Act. It is a brilliant piece of mechanical legislation.
What does it do?
It mandates the registration of all gig workers. But more importantly, it establishes a welfare board and a dedicated Social Security fund. This fund is financed by a micro-levy, a tiny tax automatically applied to every single transaction on the platform. So every time someone orders a cab or a meal, a fraction of a rupee goes into the Social Security fund for the workers.
That's a smart way to fund it.
It is the first state law of its kind and serves as a potential template. Labor experts are also aggressively calling for a National Gig Workers' Rights Act, mandatory algorithmic transparency, and the establishment of a digital labor ombudsman to specifically review automated terminations.
It is a classic, painful case of technology moving exponentially faster than legislation. But, worker welfare isn't just about labor codes, union rights, and algorithmic transparency. At its absolute base level, worker welfare is fundamentally about human physical health and biological energy.
Very true.
You can't have a productive workforce if the population is physically exhausted, which leads us directly into a major vital pivot in India's public health policy. Let's look at topic 8, the new Anaemia Mukt norms.
Anemia is arguably one of India's most pervasive, stubborn, and economically destructive public health challenges. The Ministry of Health and Family Welfare has just released completely revised norms for the Anaemia Mukt or AMB program. They are fundamentally shifting their mechanical approach from a strategy of treating severe anemia to an early action protocol.
And the data forcing this shift is deeply alarming. The National Family Health Survey data, NFHS-6 from 2023-24, shows that anemia prevalence has barely budged despite decades of massive government intervention programs.
The numbers are staggering.
57% of women between 15 and 49 years are clinically anemic. And even more shockingly, 67% of children under 5 are anemic. That means 2 out of every 3 children in India aren't getting enough iron in their blood to develop properly. Why did the old programs fail so spectacularly?
The old flagship program is called WEF's Weekly Iron and Folic Acid Supplementation. It was a massive logistical undertaking, but it struggled mechanically for 3 interconnected reasons. First, supply chain failures. The IFA tablets simply weren't always physically available at the grassroots level for the SU workers to distribute.
That's a basic logistics issue.
Second, compliance was terrible. IFA tablets, especially when taken on an empty stomach, can have severe gastrointestinal side effects. They cause nausea, stomach cramps, and dark stools.
I can completely imagine that. You give a teenager in a rural school a pill that makes their stomach hurt. They aren't going to tell you it hurts. They're just going to throw the pill in the bushes the moment you turn around.
Exactly. The compliance drop-off was massive. And third, there is a fundamental biochemical gap in the Indian diet. IFA supplements are meant to complement dietary iron, not entirely replace it. But the Indian diet is predominantly plant-based. Plant-based non-heme iron has very low bioavailability compared to iron from meat.
So it's harder for the body to absorb.
Furthermore, the high phytate content in Indian staples like cereals and legumes mechanically binds to the iron in the gut, inhibiting the body from actually absorbing it.
So even if they eat iron-rich spinach, the phytates in the roti they eat it with stop them from absorbing it. So what does this new early action protocol actually change? To use an automotive analogy, it sounds like we've been waiting for the car's engine to completely overheat and seize up before adding coolant. Now we're finally checking the temperature gauge early.
That is a perfect analogy. Under the old system, intensive medical intervention really only scaled up when a patient's hemoglobin levels dropped below 8 grams per deciliter, which is classified as severe anemia. The new norms mandate aggressive intervention the moment HB levels drop below 10 GDL, catching mild anemia before it causes permanent developmental damage.
That makes a lot more sense.
But more importantly, they are moving beyond just handing out pills. The new strategy systemically integrates fortified rice enriched with iron distribution through the massive public distribution system, or BDS. They are also adding vitamin A and zinc supplementation, which helps the body utilize iron better.
And for pregnant women?
For pregnant women diagnosed with moderate anemia who are at critical risk of maternal mortality, they are shifting away from oral pills entirely. They're moving to IV intravenous iron therapy administered at primary healthcare centers. This mechanically bypasses the gut absorption and phytate issues entirely, delivering iron directly into the bloodstream.
We absolutely have to talk about the economic cost of this because it ties directly back to everything we were discussing regarding trade, manufacturing, and global ambitions. UNICEF estimates a $24 billion annual GDP loss for India due specifically to anemia.
Yes, $24 billion in wealth evaporated every single year.
Just gone.
This happens through reduced manual worker productivity due to sheer physical exhaustion, severe cognitive impairment in children who grow up to be less capable, less productive adults, and the tragic economic and social costs of maternal mortality.
That is a massive silent blow to the economy. You cannot build the factory of the world with an exhausted workforce. And it's an economy that is currently trying desperately to insulate itself from global shocks through sheer manufacturing muscle, which perfectly bridges us to topic 9. The argument from economists that the massive PLI push must continue, combined with a mandatory push for post-Hormuz energy diversity.
This connects directly back to the supply chain vulnerabilities we explored earlier regarding the Indian Ocean and the Ever-Lovely incident. The Hormuz crisis between February and June of 2026 didn't just affect shipping routes. It violently exposed two fundamental structural weaknesses in the Indian macroeconomy: our extreme dependence on imported energy and our critical manufacturing supply chain frailties.
Let's break those down mechanically. On the energy side, India is roughly 85% dependent on imported crude oil. When a choke point like Hormuz gets squeezed by conflict, our entire economy starts suffocating. What is a specific policy response to physically mitigate that vulnerability?
The response has to be aggressive, multi-pronged energy diversification. You can't just find a new oil supplier. You have to change the energy mix entirely. The government is pushing 5 key mechanical levers.
Okay, what are they?
1, accelerating the electric vehicle transition. This isn't just about climate change. It's about structurally destroying domestic demand for imported oil. 2, heavily expanding the Strategic Petroleum Reserves, or SPR. India is building massive underground salt caverns to store crude, expanding capacity from a 9.5-day buffer to a 22-day buffer, allowing us to weather short-term geopolitical shocks without panic buying.
Makes sense.
3, developing domestic natural gas fields, like the massive KG-D6 expansion off the eastern coast. 4, investing heavily in the green hydrogen ecosystem to replace fossil fuels in heavy industries like steel and refining. And 5, setting an incredibly aggressive target for nuclear energy, aiming for 100,000 megawatts of nuclear capacity by 2047.
Okay, that covers the energy side of the crisis. But what about the manufacturing side? The sources note that the Hormuz disruption caused immediate critical shortages in fertilizers, semiconductors, and LNG components inside India.
This is where the production-linked incentive, or PLI, schemes come in. The government has launched 14 different PLI schemes across various sectors. Crucially, 6 of them are targeted at the exact critical sectors exposed by the Hormuz crisis and our over-reliance on China telecom equipment, electronics manufacturing, semiconductors, active pharmaceutical ingredients, high-efficiency solar PV modules, and advanced chemistry cell batteries.
I have to play the skeptic here, though. Economists often criticize PLIs. If a PLI is basically just a direct government cash subsidy given to a private company based on how many units they produce, aren't we just artificially propping up inefficient industries with taxpayer money? What happens to these factories when the government money inevitably stops flowing?
That's a fair question.
Are they actually building long-term resilience, or are they just cashing government checks while the window is open?
It's a very valid structural critique. The economic defense of the PLI scheme is that it is a strategic, temporary 5 to 10-year ramp-up, designed specifically to overcome initial inertia and achieve global economies of scale. The initial data is highly promising. The schemes have generated 1.97 lakh crore rupees in actual production, 64,000 crore in direct exports, and created roughly 7.5 lakh direct jobs.
But what happens when the subsidy ends?
The core argument is that manufacturers need these subsidies in the short term to overcome the inherent cost disabilities of manufacturing in India, such as high logistics friction, complex land acquisition, and elevated industrial power costs until the domestic supply chain ecosystem fully matures. If you abruptly withdraw the PLIs now, in years 3 to 5, the nascent supply chains will collapse under global price pressure, and we will instantly revert back to complete Chinese dependency.
The sources also mention impending SEZ reforms tied to this manufacturing push, special economic zones.
Yes, the Commerce Ministry is currently holding high-level meetings to revitalize SEZs, specifically targeting the China Plus One strategy, trying to attract global multinationals looking to move at least some of their manufacturing out of China.
And what are they changing?
They're looking at mechanically restoring IGST tax exemptions that were controversially removed during the 2017 GST rollout. They are also creating plug-and-play models, where the government builds the physical factory shell, ensures power and water, and a foreign company can just walk in, plug in their machinery, and start producing immediately without dealing with local red tape.
So securing our energy grids and building resilient supply chains fundamentally requires domestic manufacturing capability. But as we've seen, it also absolutely requires robust physical partnerships in the exact geographic regions those global supplies pass through. This brings us to a quiet but vital diplomatic maneuver that ties our narrative back to the ocean. Let's look at topic 10. Defense diplomacy, specifically the Indian Army in Seychelles and the Modi-Mauritius bilateral meeting.
We're circling back to the vast chessboard of the Indian Ocean here, tying back to our very first topic on SAGAR Plus E, but zooming in on the Mauritius angle. While PM Modi was physically in Seychelles, he held a highly significant bilateral meeting on the sidelines with Mauritius Prime Minister Navin Chandra Ramgoolam.
We talked extensively about Seychelles and the Assumption Island facility. Where exactly does Mauritius fit into this grand maritime strategy?
Mauritius provides incredible strategic and economic depth. Diplomatically, it is India's primary engagement hub for the Indian Ocean Commission, which is a key regional bloc. But economically, it is deeply structurally tied to India.
In what way?
Because of specific treaty shopping provisions and double taxation avoidance agreements, Mauritius is actually one of India's largest single sources of foreign direct investment inflows. Global capital routes through Mauritius into India. Furthermore, the 2021 Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or CETA, signed with Mauritius, serves as New Delhi's foundational template for negotiating economic partnerships with other small island developing states.
And what specific, tangible projects were discussed in this meeting?
They focused on a massive 500 crore rupee development credit line extended from India to Mauritius, the funding for Phase 3 of the highly visible Metro Express urban rail project in Mauritius, and crucial expansions under the Mauritius-India Development Authority. But from a military and strategic perspective, the absolute crown jewel is Agalega Island.
Let me map this out for the listener to visualize the sheer scale of this. We have the Andaman and Nicobar Islands anchoring our military presence in the eastern Indian Ocean. We just discussed the Assumption Island facility in Seychelles way out in the southwest. And now Agalega Island, which is a joint maritime aviation facility with Mauritius, located in the western Indian Ocean.
Yes. If you draw a line between Andaman, Assumption, and Agalega, you are drawing a massive physical strategic perimeter. You are creating a security triangle that spans the entire Indian Ocean.
That's brilliant.
This interconnected infrastructure allows the Indian Navy and the Indian Air Force to project power, launch long-range surveillance flights to monitor global shipping lanes, and physically enforce that SAGAR Plus doctrine of shared responsibility we discussed at the very beginning.
It is brilliant long-term geographic strategy. It's physically staking a claim on the ocean. But all this geopolitical maneuvering, the Hormuz crisis disrupting oil, the massive global trade shifts from CETA, they cause massive, invisible fluctuations in global capital and banking liquidity. Which brings us to a highly specific but critical economic indicator that acts as a barometer for this stress. Let's dive into topic 11, why FCNR loan rates are edging higher.
This requires a deep dive into the actual plumbing of international finance and how domestic banks shield themselves from global chaos. FCNRB stand for Foreign Currency Non-Resident Bank Deposits.
Okay, let's break down the jargon for the listener. What exactly is an FCNRB account mechanically?
Simply put, it is a term deposit account held in an Indian bank branch. But the actual money is held in a foreign, freely convertible currency, usually US dollars, British pounds, or euros. It is exclusively available for non-resident Indians or NRIs.
And what's the hook?
The defining mechanical feature is that both the principal amount and the interest earned are fully repatriable and are paid out in that same foreign currency. Therefore, the NRI taking out the deposit takes on absolutely zero exchange rate risk.
Okay, so if I'm an NRI living in New Jersey and I put 10,000 US dollars into an FCNRB account in SBI, I get $10,000 plus interest back, regardless of whether the Indian rupee crashes or skyrockets in the meantime. It's a completely safe harbor for my dollars. But why are the interest rates on these specific accounts suddenly going up right now, post-Hormuz?
Because Indian banks desperately need foreign currency to manage their institutional forex exposure. When a geopolitical crisis like the Hormuz conflict hits, global oil prices fluctuate violently. India imports oil, and that oil must be paid for in US dollars. If the rupee weakens against the dollar due to the crisis, or if Indian banks foresee a sudden need to provide large amounts of dollar liquidity to Indian importers to finance their trade, those banks need a massive internal war chest of foreign currency.
Wait, so the bank is just gambling on the exchange rate?
No, that's the beauty of it. They are hedging. It's essentially Indian banks offering a VIP premium interest rate to NRIs to incentivize them to park their dollars in India. This gives the Indian banks the physical ammunition, the dollar liquidity they need to weather geopolitical storms, honor import letters of credit, and manage asset liability mismatches without having to go out and buy expensive dollars on the open market during a crisis.
That makes perfect sense. How do they calculate that premium?
The interest rates on these accounts are strictly regulated, but are usually linked to global overnight benchmarks, like SOFR, the Secured Overnight Financing Rate, plus a spread or a premium determined by the bank based on their need. When Indian banks need more dollars, they mechanically increase that spread to attract the NRI funds.
So it's a lever they can pull.
It is a vital, decentralized mechanism for the banking sector to manage liquidity independently, without relying solely on the Reserve Bank of India having to deplete its national forex reserves.
It's honestly mind-blowing how a naval conflict in the Middle East mechanically forces a bank manager in Mumbai to increase the interest rate on a deposit account for a software engineer living in New Jersey. The global plumbing is entirely connected. But, while we manage these incredibly complex economics and conflicts here on Earth, human curiosity, backed by substantial science funding, is pushing us completely off the planet.
On to Mars.
Exactly. Let's look at topic 12. The enduring mystery of life on Mars and what we are learning from NASA's Perseverance rover data.
This represents one of the most profound scientific endeavors in human history, the field of astrobiology. NASA's Perseverance rover, which is a massive nuclear-powered mobile laboratory, has been operating inside the Jezero crater on Mars since February 2021, and it has just delivered its most tantalizing complex evidence yet.
Why did they land in the Jezero crater specifically? Out of an entire planet, why that one spot?
Because orbital mechanics in geological mapping showed that Jezero is a 45-kilometer-wide ancient lakebed. Billions of years ago, it was filled to the brim with liquid water. Perseverance hasn't just found evidence of a quick flash flood. It has driven over, photographed, and chemically analyzed clear, intricate river delta deposits.
So water flowed there for a long time.
This indicates sustained, long-duration liquid water flowing into a standing lake, creating the perfect environment for potential biology to take hold.
And the big news breaking from the May 2026 data drop is about organic molecules, right? The Sherlock instrument found something big. Does this mean they found actual fossilized life?
We have to be very precise with the scientific mechanics here. Sherlock is an instrument on the rover's robotic arm that uses Raman spectrometry and deep UV luminescence scanning. It detected complex organic molecules deeply embedded inside the rock cores it drilled.
Okay, but what does that mean?
Organic molecules are the fundamental building blocks of life. They contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. However, detecting them is not conclusive evidence of life. They are not definitive biosignatures. Organic molecules can be created by completely non-biological, abiotic geological processes, like water interacting with volcanic rock. But what they unequivocally prove is that the chemical conditions capable of supporting and sustaining life were absolutely present in that lakebed.
So we know all the ingredients for life were sitting in the bowl and the kitchen was warm enough, but we don't know if biology actually baked the cake.
Exactly. Mars experienced what planetary scientists call a Goldilocks window, roughly 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. During that epoch, it had liquid water on the surface, a much thicker atmosphere, abundant chemical energy, and crucially, a protective global magnetic field.
What happened? Why is it a freezing, irradiated, dead desert today?
The leading planetary model involves the Theia impact hypothesis and rapid planetary cooling. Mars is significantly smaller than Earth, so its internal molten core cooled much faster. When the liquid iron core solidified, the planetary magnetic dynamo mechanically shut down. The magnetic field vanished.
And without the magnetic field?
Without that magnetic shield to deflect the intense solar wind coming from the sun, the solar radiation literally stripped away the Martian atmosphere molecule by molecule over millions of years. The pressure dropped, causing the oceans to boil off or freeze into the polar caps.
Tragic mechanical planetary death. So how do we find out for sure if microscopic life existed before that catastrophe happened?
Perseverance has meticulously drilled and collected 38 sealed titanium rock cores. But a rover, no matter how advanced, has power and weight limits on its instruments. To get absolute, irrefutable proof of microfossils, we need to bring those rocks back to massive, building-sized electron microscopes on Earth. That is the goal of the incredibly complex Mars Sample Return mission, which is currently targeted for 2035.
And more importantly for our listeners, how does India's space program fit into this global astrobiological puzzle?
ISRO is actively, aggressively preparing Mangalyaan-2, or MOM-2. You'll recall Mangalyaan-1 was a historic, flawless triumph in 2014. India became the first Asian country to reach Mars and the first nation ever to do it on its maiden attempt. That orbiter lasted for an incredible 8 years.
And the new one?
Mangalyaan-2 is targeting the 2027 Mars opposition window, which is the brief period when Earth and Mars align closest in their orbits, requiring the least amount of fuel to cross the distance. MOM-2 will carry highly advanced scientific payloads to complement these global efforts, focusing on atmospheric loss and surface mineralogy.
It's incredible to think about ISRO probes orbiting another planet while we sit here. But, the extreme technological leaps required to manage a robot on Mars, specifically how it handles data when there is a 14-minute communication delay with Earth, lead directly to brilliant innovations for managing data right here on Earth during crises.
Yes, the edge computing link.
Exactly. Let's look at how the physical realities of space exploration bridge into domestic technology. We are going to synthesize topics 13 and 14. Smart AI caching for disaster management and the new auditing portal for rural schemes.
These two items perfectly illustrate the critical spectrum of building resilient digital infrastructure. On one end, you have cutting-edge research into smart AI caching. When a massive disaster strikes like an earthquake in the Himalayas or a supercyclone in Odisha, the physical communication networks, the cell towers and fiber optic cables, are violently fragmented.
The network goes down right when rescue workers need data the most. So how does AI caching solve a broken cable?
By anticipating the break, AI predictive models analyze historical disaster patterns and predict exactly what data emergency medical responders and NDRF teams will need in a specific geography. Before the network fully collapses, the AI automatically pre-caches or downloads and stores the critical data, like medical protocols, local topographical maps, and resource manifests, onto localized edge devices or secure servers physically located within the vulnerable zone.
So they don't need the wider internet.
Exactly. So even if the town is cut off from the global internet, the local rescue teams still have instantaneous access to life-saving data hosted locally. It operates just like a Mars rover, continuing its mission while cut off from Earth.
That is a brilliant mechanical application of edge computing. And on the other end of the digital spectrum, we have topic 14, the government launching a massive new centralized portal for auditing rural schemes. This is about using digital infrastructure to enforce accountability.
Yes, this is about ensuring that the hundreds of thousands of crores deployed for rural development actually translate into physical assets on the ground. The portal mandates strict geotagging of assets like wells, panchayat buildings, and rural roads. An auditor doesn't just look at a paper ledger. They verify the GPS coordinates and time-stamped photographs of the completed project uploaded to the portal, drastically cutting down on ghost projects and administrative leakage.
Both of these technologies are about utilizing advanced digital architecture to create systemic resilience, whether against the violent unpredictability of natural disasters or the mundane reality of bureaucratic corruption. But, as we know all too well, deploying a flawless digital audit system sounds great on a dashboard in New Delhi. But in reality, when you try to implement grassroots governance, it often collides violently with regional political egos. Which brings us to topic 15. The Kerala Minister's PMA Logo Row, which is a fascinating, highly visible study in the tensions of cooperative federalism.
This is a classic center-state flashpoint. The Kerala Housing Minister, P.A. Mohammed-Rias, recently highlighted a bitter administrative dispute. In Kerala, houses built under the flagship Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, Gramin or PMAG, the rural housing scheme, are being constructed and publicly branded with the state government's own Life Mission logo, rather than the explicitly mandated central PMA logo and the Prime Minister's photograph.
And the center didn't take kindly to that. The Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs in New Delhi issued a blunt notice threatening to physically withhold future funding tranches if the central branding isn't immediately restored. What is the actual legal foundation here? Can the center legally force a state government to put the Prime Minister's face on a brick wall?
Strictly legally speaking, yes. The center has an incredibly strong case based on the mechanics of government funding. PMAY is what is classified as a centrally sponsored scheme, or a CSS. Under a CSS, the center provides the bulk of the financial capital, usually a 60% share for standard states and a 90% share for hilly or northeast states.
So they pay for most of it.
Right. The administrative guidelines of the scheme, which every state government legally signs and agrees to when they accept the funds, explicitly mandate the standardized display of the PMA logo and scheme information on the completed asset. It is a binding contractual condition of the financial grant.
But the states are pushing back hard. And the sources note that Kerala isn't alone. It is the fifth state in 2026 to clash with the center over this exact issue, alongside Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, Telangana, and Punjab. The states argue they aren't just passive recipients of federal charity.
Correct. The state's counter-argument is deeply rooted in the philosophy of federalism and the mechanical reality of implementation. They point out that they co-fund these projects, contributing their own 40% share from state coffers. But more importantly, the state administrative machinery does all the heavy, complex lifting.
The actual work on the ground.
Exactly. State officials acquire the contested land, identify and verify the beneficiaries, resolve local disputes, and physically supervise the construction over months. They argue that an integrated welfare program that relies so heavily on state money and state bureaucratic effort should carry integrated branding, or the state's own branding, to accurately reflect their massive contribution to the final product.
So what does the listener need to take away here? Who is right? Is this a blatant legal violation of a contract by rebellious states, or is it heavy-handed federal overreach by an insecure center?
If we look at it strictly impartially legally, the center holds the purse strings, and the signed guidelines are unambiguous. However, politically and administratively, it reflects a profound structural tension in India's cooperative federalism. Interestingly, the landmark 1988 Sarkari Commission on Center-State Relations specifically addressed this. It recommended that the center should not impose rigid conditions beyond what is strictly mechanically necessary to implement a centrally sponsored scheme.
So states use that to argue against the logos?
Yes. States argue that forced political branding falls into that unnecessary category. Conversely, the center argues that a massive scheme deploying 1.1 lakh crore rupees globally requires strict national tracking, uniform identity, and federal accountability. Ultimately, stripped of the legal jargon, is a bare-knuckle political battle over who gets to extract the electoral credit from the grateful voter living inside that newly built house.
It is the ultimate real estate branding war. But while politicians fight fiercely over whose logo gets painted on the outside of the houses, the real foundational work determining India's future is happening silently inside the schools. Let's look at topic 16, how schools can tackle adolescent malnutrition.
This connects directly back to our earlier deep dive discussion on the Anaemia Mukt Early Action Protocol. The Ministry of Health and Family Welfare has realized a fundamental logistical truth. You cannot effectively, consistently deliver preventative public health to millions of teenagers through isolated rural health clinics.
Because they just won't go.
Exactly. Teenagers don't voluntarily go to clinics unless they are gravely ill. The ultimate, most efficient delivery mechanism, the most pervasive logistics network in the entire country, is the school system.
Because it's a captive audience. The students are physically sitting there at desks every single day.
Exactly. The grim NFHS-6 data we discussed earlier proves the mechanical failure of relying solely on overworked AJ workers to track down adolescents in villages to distribute weekly iron pills. The new strategy pivots entirely. It implements mandatory comprehensive anemia screening at two critical educational bottlenecks: entry into Class 6 and the transition into Class 9.
That specific timing isn't an accident, is it? Why Class 6 and 9?
The timing is highly deliberate biological targeting. It hits the demographic window right before these young girls enter their prime reproductive age. The medical goal is to identify and mechanically correct the anemia before a young woman ever enters her first trimester of pregnancy years later.
To protect the child.
Yes. The first trimester is the most critical, vulnerable period for both maternal survival and fetal cognitive development. If she enters pregnancy anemic, the damage to the child is already done.
That makes total sense. But how do they get around the compliance issues? We talked about kids throwing away the IFA pills because of the horrible stomach aches. Changing the location from a clinic to a classroom doesn't make the pill hurt any less.
They solve it by integrating the medicine directly into the food supply via the midday meal scheme. Instead of just handing out harsh pills on an empty stomach, schools are now mandated to serve fortified foods, specifically rice, mechanically fortified with iron, folic acid, and vitamin B12 as part of the hot-cooked meal.
Oh, that's smart.
When iron is consumed with food, the gastrointestinal side effects are drastically minimized. Furthermore, they are utilizing trained teachers to directly monitor the consumption, ensuring vastly higher compliance rates than when kids are trusted to take a pill at home unsupervised.
It is such a pragmatic solution. You can't teach an undernourished, exhausted brain. At the grassroots level, the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education aren't two separate buildings. They converge entirely inside the biology of the same child.
It is the ultimate convergence of human infrastructure.
And while the physical health and biology of that child is maintained by the fortified rice in the school cafeteria, the actual mechanism of their education has moved firmly, irreversibly into the digital cloud. Let's look at topic 17. Diksha, the platform powering India's digital learning ecosystem.
Diksha, which stands for the Digital Infrastructure for Knowledge Sharing, is a monumental digital platform. It was originally launched in 2017 by the Ministry of Education and is hosted by the INSERT, but its scale today in 2026 is almost difficult to comprehend.
The PIB notes provide the latest metrics. Over 6.5 crore registered, active users, over 67 crore distinct learning sessions completed, and it's available in 36 Indian languages, encompassing all 22 scheduled languages.
It has become the absolute digital backbone of the National Education Policy, the NEP 2020. Specifically, it is the primary delivery vehicle for achieving the foundational literacy and numeracy, or FLN, goals under the NPN Bharat initiative. We have to remember, during the catastrophic COVID-19 school closures, Diksha was the sole mechanical reason that 250 million Indian school students had any semblance of educational continuity.
The feature I find most fascinating, the real mechanical genius of it, is the integration of QR-coded physical textbooks. How exactly does that bridge the gap for a student who doesn't have a laptop or a broadband connection?
It bridges the physical-digital divide brilliantly by leveraging the one piece of tech that is ubiquitous: the cheap smartphone. Every single physical insert textbook printed today has specific Diksha QR codes embedded directly onto the printed pages. Imagine the students sitting in a remote, low-bandwidth village in Bihar.
Okay, picture that.
They are struggling with a complex physics concept on page 42. They can take their parents' basic smartphone, scan the QR code on that specific page, and the Diksha app instantly pulls up highly compressed, supplementary digital content like an interactive 3D video explaining the concept, a practice quiz, or a simulated digital lab that is directly, specifically related to the text they are reading.
It's literally turning a static piece of paper into a dynamic hyperlink. It completely democratizes access to high-quality pedagogical explanations that were previously only available in elite private schools. But Diksha isn't an isolated one-off success. It is just one shining pillar in a massive 12-year architectural project that has completely redefined the Indian state. Let's bring all these threads together with our final topic, topic 18, 12 years of digital India.
The Digital India program was officially launched on July 1st, 2015. Looking back over these past 12 years, it is undeniable that it has fundamentally transformed the macroeconomic and social landscape of the country.
The macro numbers are staggering. 940 million active internet users, making India the second largest digital market globally. 650 million smartphone users, 6.8 lakh gram panchayats physically connected with optical fiber under the HeartNet project, And my personal favorite statistic, representing the velocity of money, 18 billion UPI transactions occurring every single month. The scale is unprecedented in human history.
The scale is immense, but the true lasting genius of digital India isn't just the sheer number of cheap data connections. It is the underlying invisible architecture of what is collectively called India Stack. This is the seamless integration of a foundational identity layer, AHAR, which now has over 1.4 billion enrollments integrated instantly with eKYC authentication, the DigiLocker document storage system, the UPI payments layer, and Pacific sectoral systems like Cohen for health and FASTag for transit.
It is a fully integrated, interoperable digital ecosystem. But how does that differ from what tech companies built in the West?
That is the crucial distinction. India created a digital public infrastructure, or DPI. In the West, the foundational layers of the digital economy are owned by private monopolies, think Visa and MasterCard for payments, or Google and Apple for identity. The Indian government recognized that this infrastructure is too critical to be privatized.
So they made it public.
They built the base layer, the UPI rails, the Aadhaar identity verification as a free, open-source public utility, exactly like building a national highway system or an electrical grid. They then allowed private companies, from massive multinational banks down to a street vendor selling chai, to build their own private applications and businesses on top of those free public rails.
It lowered the barrier to entry to zero. And what is the tangible economic result of that architecture?
India's core digital economy is now estimated to be worth $500 billion and is compounding at over 15% a year. It has fostered the world's third-largest startup ecosystem, birthing over 110,000 recognized startups. But perhaps the most significant long-term geopolitical outcome is the export of this model. India's specific brand of DPI is now being aggressively adopted and implemented by over 50 countries across the global south.
So if we look at the big picture, we have transitioned from being the back office of the world, just answering customer service phones and writing outsourced code for Western tech companies, to actually designing and exporting the fundamental digital plumbing that other sovereign nations are using to run their entire economies. It is a massive structural shift in global standing.
It is a complete paradigm shift. India is no longer just participating in the global digital future. It is foundational to its architecture.
Wow. We have covered an immense, complex landscape today. Thank you, our listener, for taking this deep journey through today's UPSC topics with us. We've gone from military integrated battle groups compressing the ODA loop and Mars rovers analyzing ancient river deltas, to gig worker constitutional rights, the tensions of cooperative federalism, and the mechanics of rural audits.
If we connect all these threads back to the very beginning of our conversation, it really highlights the staggering complexity of managing a modern, aspiring superpower.
It does. The X-ray is indeed murky, and I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you process all this. We just discussed India proudly exporting its world-class digital public infrastructure to 50 nations, building a $500 billion digital economy, and preparing to send sophisticated probes to Mars in 2027. Yet simultaneously, on the exact same day, we are desperately struggling to prevent the biological genetic decay of our tigers, and we are fighting a grueling battle against 67% childhood anemia because our teenagers physically cannot absorb the iron from their daily diets.
It's quite a dichotomy.
As India rapidly, aggressively builds its future on the digital cloud and in the vacuum of space, the ultimate test of its superpower ambitions won't just be the brilliance of its tech stack or the lethality of its military doctrine. The true test will be whether it can simultaneously resolve the very physical, very earthly, very muddy challenges of its biosphere and the basic biology of its citizens.
It raises the ultimate defining question for this generation of policymakers and citizens alike.
Can a nation successfully live in 2 centuries at once? Keep questioning the simple narratives, keep exploring the deeper mechanical currents behind the headlines, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.